Welcome to a Moment in Time podcast. I'm your host, Eric.
And I'm Freya.
So think about this. If a spacecraft traveling at, like, half the speed of light hits a tiny piece of space debris, we're talking the size of a single garden pea.
Right, something incredibly small.
Exactly. The resulting explosion would equal the force of 2 atomic bombs.
Which is just a completely staggering piece of physics, honestly.
It really is. And, that math is exactly why a growing number of researchers are just entirely abandoning the classic sci-fi idea of aliens visiting us from outer space.
Yeah, they're turning to a much more complex and, frankly, a much more terrifying alternative.
Right, because what if the things hovering in our skies haven't traveled across the galaxy at all? What if they've just been right here on Earth, sharing this space with us since, well, the dawn of humanity?
I mean, it completely upends the traditional narrative. We're so used to the idea of this physical nuts and bolts threat,
Like Independence Day.
Exactly. You look up, you see the massive metal ships descending, and it's a very clean concept. A physical craft from a physical place. But when you delve into the actual diagnostic landscape of modern unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAPs, the extraterrestrial model falls apart almost immediately.
And that is exactly the mission of this deep dive today. We're taking a massive stack of research, including theological essays from Pastor Tom Hicks, some deep dives from the Christian Standard and Society reviews, and historical analyses of ancient texts.
Yeah, it's a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but the goal is to understand how UAPs are currently being interpreted through a deeply theological and historical lens. Because look, while government organizations and NASA are having these big congressional hearings about radar anomalies and flight telemetry,
there's this massive, completely parallel conversation happening at the exact same time.
Exactly. It's an attempt to map very ancient spiritual frameworks onto tomorrow's headlines.
And to understand why this shift is happening, we really have to look at the sheer physics of interstellar travel, which Pastor Tom Hicks breaks down in his essay.
The math is just, it's incredibly prohibitive.
It is. Even if a craft could achieve the speed of light, which, based on our current understanding of physics, is the absolute speed limit of the universe,
Right.
it would still take 100,000 years just to cross our own Milky Way galaxy.
100,000 years. And to reach our closest neighboring galaxy, Andromeda, you are looking at a 2.3 million year journey.
And it isn't just the time either, it's the energy requirement.
Yeah.
The sources point out that to accelerate a physical craft to just 90% of the speed of light, you would need the energy output of 73 million atomic bombs.
73 million.
Yeah, to put that into a modern perspective, you'd need to harness the combined power output of all United States energy facilities and just let them run continuously for 351 years.
Wow.
And that is just to speed the craft up. You would need the exact same astronomical amount of energy to slow it down once you actually arrived.
Plus, as we mentioned earlier with that garden pea analogy, space is not just some empty vacuum.
No, it's littered with micrometeoroids, dust, debris.
Right. So as a craft approaches the speed of light, the kinetic energy of literally any impact becomes catastrophic. A grain of sand hitting a hull at those speeds would hit like a bunker-busting missile. The structural integrity required to survive a cosmic road trip like that, it defies any plausible material science.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I always like to look at the skeptical side of things.
Sure.
The vast majority of UFO sightings don't actually require us to do this complex math at all. Researchers openly acknowledge that about 95% of all sightings are just misidentifications.
Yeah, we were talking about swamp gas illuminating in the night, the planet Venus looking unusually bright, weather balloons, meteorites.
Or even psychological events like sleep paralysis. Doing the math on interstellar travel is like trying to drive a bus through an infinite minefield at Mach 10. It's impossible, so it probably isn't happening.
But the entire debate really hinges on that remaining 5%, the totally unexplained cases.
Mm-hmm.
If they aren't physically crossing space in metal ships, how are they appearing in our skies?
What's fascinating here is that the failure of the extraterrestrial model is exactly what gave rise to the interdimensional hypothesis, or the extradimensional terrestrial hypothesis.
Right, the idea that these entities are crossing dimensions, not space.
Exactly. They exist in a reality or a dimension or a frequency that just overlaps with ours, but remains totally outside our normal sensory perception.
I always think of it like a dog whistle. When you blow a dog whistle, the sound is physically present in the room. It's a real acoustic wave bouncing off the walls.
But we just don't hear it.
Right, because human ears aren't biologically tuned to that specific high frequency. We perceive the room as completely silent. The sound is there. We just lack the biological hardware to perceive it.
That's a great analogy. The interdimensional hypothesis suggests these traps operate similarly. They are existing on a frequency we just can't tune into until they deliberately shift into our visible spectrum.
Which elegantly explains the radar anomalies that baffle military pilots, right? UAPs are constantly reported as simply popping into existence out of nowhere.
Yeah, performing these right-angle turns at speeds that would turn a biological being into jelly, and then just blinking out of existence. They aren't flying away at warp speed. They're just stepping back through that dimensional veil.
But, realizing they aren't scientists from outer space opens up a much darker question. If they are interdimensional and they're sharing our environment, what exactly do they want with us?
Yeah, and this is where the physical evidence and the psychological aftermath of these encounters come into play. And I'll warn you, it gets incredibly unsettling.
Jacques Vallée is a crucial figure here, isn't he?
He is. He was a protege of J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who originally investigated UFOs for the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book.
Right.
Vallée spent years documenting the physical injuries left behind by UFO encounters, specifically focusing on cases in remote areas like Brazil. These aren't just stories of people seeing strange lights in the sky. He documented over 100 cases involving scorch marks on the ground, measurable radiation, and severe bodily harm to witnesses.
The sources mention a very specific injury called Klieg conjunctivitis.
Yes.
Which is a term that comes from the early days of Hollywood, when actors would get these severe blinding eye burns from the intense carbon arc lamps on set.
Right.
Vallée found that people who looked directly at the actinic ultraviolet rays emitted by these crafts suffered the exact same agonizing burns. I mean, their corneas were essentially sunburned, feeling like their eyes were just filled with sand.
And Vallée concluded that these injuries were not just accidental byproducts of a propulsion system. Based on the patterns, they seemed deliberately inflicted by a technology or an intelligence that was completely apathetic to human suffering.
Which is terrifying on its own.
But as horrific as the physical trauma is, researchers note that the psychological trauma of the abduction experience is far more profound.
It follows a pattern known as the classic abduction syndrome. And it happens globally across all these different cultures, but the sequence remains shockingly consistent.
It almost always starts with capture, usually involving a terrifying unnatural paralysis in the middle of the night.
Right. Following the capture is the examination phase. And honestly, this is where the extraterrestrial narrative starts to show deep logical flaws for me.
How so?
Well, the examinations are routinely described as highly invasive, crude, and agonizingly painful, often involving the taking of genetic material or reproductive fluids.
Yeah, they are.
But from a purely logical standpoint, that makes absolutely no sense. Human doctors today, with our relatively primitive modern medicine, can draw blood or harvest DNA with a simple cheek swab or a tiny needle.
Right, we can do it without causing intense trauma or leaving permanent scars.
Exactly. The idea that a civilization billions of years ahead of us, capable of interdimensional travel, needs to use these crude, torturous methods to get a DNA sample is just absurd.
Which leads researchers to look at the next phase, the conference. During this phase, the abductee is essentially indoctrinated.
Indoctrinated how?
They're often given special chosen identities, warned about impending global catastrophes, and told explicitly that world religions, especially Christianity, are false and primitive. Sometimes this is coupled with a theophany, which is a staged, deeply manipulative religious experience designed to elicit awe and gain the person's complete cooperation.
And finally, you have the return, where memories are often wiped or replaced with what psychologists call screen memories, like remembering an owl staring through the window instead of an actual entity.
But the most vital piece of this whole puzzle is the aftermath. According to a comprehensive 1993 study cited in our sources, the overwhelming majority of abductees don't just walk away with a strange story. They experience a...
Marshall Applewhite convinced his followers that a spacecraft was trailing the Hale-Bopp comet, leading to a mass suicide so they could shed their earthly bodies and, quote, beam up. The Raelian movement is another one, founded on the belief that a species called the Elohim created humanity in laboratories.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you step back and look at the behavior of these entities, paralyzing victims in the dark, utilizing profound deceit, performing unnecessarily painful exams, and using telepathy to fundamentally manipulate human belief systems, this isn't a scientific expedition.
No, it's a cosmic rebranding.
They are utilizing the exact historical and behavioral resume of a demon. This aligns incredibly closely with ancient biblical warnings. 1 Timothy 4.1 explicitly warns about people paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons.
So the sources suggest that the real goal of these entities isn't scientific exploration or genetic harvesting at all. The pain, the paralysis, and that false medical facade are just psychological tools for spiritual indoctrination.
It's a method of breaking down the human will and replacing it with a new, orchestrated theology.
It's a chilling prospect. The idea that the extraterrestrials we are writing sci-fi movies about today are actually the exact same entities humanity has feared for thousands of years, just wearing a modern technological mask.
And this is where the historical precedent becomes so important, because this phenomenon didn't just start in the 1940s with Roswell.
No. Ancient texts are filled with descriptions of divine or supernatural encounters that sound remarkably indistinguishable from modern UAP sightings. Take the prophet Ezekiel in the Hebrew Bible.
Right, his visions.
He describes visions of divine beings and crafts that appear as wheels within wheels, covered with eyes round about. He notes that they moved with supernatural speed, able to dart in any direction without turning, totally defying inertia.
To someone reading that text today, it sounds like a perfect description of a physics-defying glowing orb or a flying saucer.
And that takes us to Genesis 6, which is easily one of the most debated and controversial passages in this entire theological discussion. The text says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, took them as wives, and produced offspring known as the Nephilim.
The mighty men of old, men of renown.
Exactly.
In Second Temple Judaism, the dominant literal reading of this passage was that these sons of God were rebellious, fallen angels who broke a cosmic boundary by mating with human women. The resulting offspring, the Nephilim, were these giant hybrid creatures.
And this narrative is expanded upon in massive detail in the non-canonical Book of Enoch.
The Book of Enoch is fascinating because it doesn't just describe a random interbreeding event. It describes a targeted, strategic corruption of humanity. It claims that 200 angels, known as the Watchers, led by a figure named Samyaza, descended on Mount Hermon.
And they brought illicit knowledge with them. They taught humans forbidden arts. They taught men metallurgy to make swords and weapons, which introduced advanced warfare.
They taught women how to make cosmetics and use root cuttings, introducing seduction and sorcery.
They corrupted the human bloodline and human society so thoroughly that it ultimately prompted the catastrophic flood of Noah to wipe the slate clean.
Furthermore, this tradition holds that when the giant physical bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed in the floodwaters, their disembodied hybrid spirits actually survived. Those spirits became the demons that now roam the earth, constantly seeking physical bodies to inhabit and people to deceive.
This framework of intelligent, non-human entities interacting with us isn't isolated to Judeo-Christian texts either. We see exact parallels in Arabian paganism with the jinn.
Right, the jinn were believed to be created from smokeless fire, which is a completely different origin than angels or humans.
And they possess the ability to shapeshift and mate with humans. In medieval European folklore, you have countless reports of people being abducted by fairies and elves.
These medieval victims reported being paralyzed in the woods, taken to glowing subterranean realms, experiencing missing time, and having their beliefs manipulated.
It is the exact same abduction syndrome we see today, just described with the vocabulary of the Middle Ages.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the cultural imprint is undeniable. From the ancient Egyptian execration texts cursing giant enemies, to Japanese statues dating back to 3000 BC that feature large chests and complete helmets resembling modern spacesuits, cultures worldwide have built frameworks to understand these interactions.
But I do need to push back here on the Nephilim narrative, because it is far from a universally accepted fact, even within theology. Heavyweights like Augustine of Hippo and John Calvin, as well as mainstream Orthodox Judaism, make a completely different view.
Right, the Sethite view.
Exactly. They argue that angels, being purely spiritual entities, literally lack the biological hardware to reproduce with humans. They interpret the sons of God simply as the righteous human lineage of Seth and the daughters of men as the unrighteous, rebellious lineage of Cain.
So under this view, the Nephilim weren't half-angel giants. They were just the wicked, powerful human warlords that resulted from those two human groups intermarrying.
Exactly. That is a crucial counter-tradition. It grounds the text in human politics rather than supernatural biology. We also have to acknowledge the long, embarrassing history of hoaxes when it comes to giants.
Oh, absolutely.
People have been faking Nephilim evidence for centuries to make a quick buck. In 1577, massive bones were found in Lucerne, Switzerland, and were immediately paraded around as the remains of a 19-foot Nephilim giant. Centuries later, scientists confirmed they were just mammoth bones.
Yeah, and then there's the Cardiff giant.
Yes. In 1869, a man named George Hull had a giant block of gypsum carved into a 10-foot man, buried it in New York, and had it discovered. It was a complete manufactured hoax.
The history of hoaxes is important, but it's equally important to look at how the overarching theory of demonic deception is being actively applied to our modern world. This brings us to a highly speculative but culturally massive theological theory explored in Society Reviews.
And it's vital to look at how this theory is being presented in our source material. We are talking about this not as a proven empirical fact, but as a fascinating and deeply influential lens through which millions of people might soon be interpreting global events. So what does this all mean?
Well, the theory presented connects the modern UFO disclosure movement directly to biblical eschatology, specifically the end times and the concept of the pre-tribulation rapture. The rapture is the theological belief held by many evangelicals that millions of Christians will suddenly and supernaturally vanish from the earth just before a 7-year period of global tribulation.
The thought experiment goes like this. If millions of people simply disappear in an instant, the unbelieving world is going to demand an explanation.
Right.
And Satan, described as the ultimate deceiver, would need a watertight cover story to prevent people from realizing the biblical God is real. The article posits that the last 70 years of UFO movies, pop culture obsession, and even recent government UAP disclosures are actually a form of deep cultural conditioning.
Humanity is being systematically prepped to believe in and trust advanced extraterrestrials. The theory suggests that in the aftermath of a rapture event, fallen angels will stage a massive global disclosure.
They will reveal themselves, claiming to be the advanced extraterrestrial creators of humanity.
Exactly. Their cover story for the missing millions will be that they harvested those people for a cosmic purpose, or perhaps removed them because their primitive religious beliefs were holding back human evolution.
It frames the entire modern alien phenomenon as an orchestrated satanic deception. The source argues this aligns perfectly with the rise of the Antichrist and the strong delusion warned about in the book of 2 Thessalonians.
A delusion sent to those who reject the truth, facilitated by lying wonders. And believers of this theory point to a very specific, recurring anecdote in UFO abduction lore to back this up.
Oh, this part is wild.
It is. Abductees frequently report that while they are paralyzed on the examination table, enduring these horrific procedures, if they manage to invoke the name of Jesus Christ, the alien entities immediately flee in distress, and the abduction ends.
The logic there is powerful, you know. An extraterrestrial biologist from the Alpha Centauri star system wouldn't care if a human yelled a random religious name. It would be meaningless to them.
But a demonic entity absolutely would care, because it is subject to spiritual authority. It demonstrates how actively believers are trying to map biblical prophecy onto modern secular phenomena.
They view the entire alien narrative not as a scientific mystery, but as a deliberate lie designed to obscure God's redemptive plan for humanity.
But living with that perspective creates a massive psychological burden. If every blurry light in the sky is a demon and every government disclosure is a satanic setup, how do you live a normal life?
That's where the counter-argument comes in, arguing for deep spiritual and intellectual restraint. We look to an article by Jerry Harris in the Christian Standard for this perspective.
Harris makes a very grounded, necessary point. He notes that while the Bible absolutely affirms the reality of the unseen spiritual realm, angels, demons, and spiritual warfare, a gap in human scientific knowledge is not proof of a preferred religious explanation.
Right. We have to look at how organizations like NASA and AARO, the government's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, actually define these objects.
They define UAPs strictly as unidentified.
Unidentified does not mean demonic. It does not mean extraterrestrial. It does not mean supernatural. It literally just means we do not currently possess enough data to identify the object.
Exactly.
It could be a sensor artifact glitching a fighter jet's radar, a highly classified piece of military drone technology, or a weird atmospheric weather balloon.
Harris argues that Christians lose their credibility when they treat a mystery as permission to preach certainty where God has not spoken. Just because something in the sky is unexplained doesn't give you license to declare it an end times deception.
It's like doing a massive jigsaw puzzle. You have all these pieces laid out on the table, and there are gaps. If you have a few missing pieces, treating every single empty space as undeniable proof that the puzzle is actually a picture of a ghost is intellectually dishonest.
You just don't have those pieces yet.
This raises an important question. How, then, should a person react to all of this uncertainty?
Harris points directly to the Apostle Paul's words in Ephesians 6. The Bible talks extensively about spiritual warfare, but it never instructs believers to fight that war by obsessively decoding strange lights in the sky or chasing hidden knowledge about Nephilim bloodlines on the internet.
Paul says to stand. You fight spiritual warfare by putting on truth, righteousness, and faith in your daily life.
It's fought with biblical faithfulness, not conspiracy theories. Harris warns that endless speculation actually distracts people from the core truths of their faith.
It makes them intensely vulnerable to deception because they start assuming every government statement is a lie and every shadow is a demon. It harvests anxiety instead of shepherding souls.
He also specifically calls out the modern misuse of Hebrews 13.2. That is the verse that says, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it."
Right. UFO enthusiasts often use this verse as a theological decoder ring for aerial phenomena, claiming it proves angels are everywhere in physical disguise.
But Harris notes that taking the text in that direction strips it of its actual context. The verse is a practical command about treating actual human beings in need with love and humility, not an invitation to search for a hidden supernatural identity behind every unusual event.
We have covered a massive amount of ground in this deep dive. We started with the sheer physics-defying impossibility of interstellar space travel, which is actively pushing researchers away from the idea of extraterrestrials and toward the interdimensional hypothesis.
We examined the chilling physical evidence gathered by researchers like Jacques Vallée and the deeply traumatic psychological aftermath of abductions, noting how perfectly they mirror the historical markers of demonic oppression and spiritual manipulation.
We traced those behavioral parallels back through ancient history, looking at the complex theological debates surrounding the Nephilim, the Watchers in the Book of Enoch, and global folklore that has always spoken of non-human entities interacting with us.
We explored the highly speculative but culturally significant theory that modern UAP disclosure might be a form of conditioning for the end times. And finally, we brought it back to a grounded call for intellectual and spiritual restraint, reminding ourselves that unidentified simply means we lack data and we shouldn't fill the gaps in our knowledge with fear.
So why does all this matter to you? Whether you are insanely curious about the latest UFO congressional hearings or you just want to sound incredibly well-informed at your next dinner party, this deep dive reveals something profound about human nature.
It does.
It shows how humanity constantly attempts to map the terrifying unknown using our deepest-held frameworks. Whether we are utilizing the complex language of advanced physics, the mythology of ancient history, or the eschatology of biblical theology, we are all just trying to make sense of the dark.
And I will leave you with this final thought to mull over. If the interdimensional hypothesis holds any water, well, if these entities aren't crossing the vast, unimaginable emptiness of the galaxy, but are simply crossing a dimensional veil right here on Earth, it forces us to ask a rather unsettling question. What other seemingly empty spaces in your daily life might actually be incredibly crowded, just waiting for the veil to thin?
Next time you look up at the night sky and expect to see a physical metal ship descending from the stars, maybe you should be looking a little closer to home.
Oh.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. That wraps it up for this deep dive. Thanks for watching A Moment in Time podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe.